Okay, so we were talking about evolutionary psychology and we were looking at understanding human nature. Yesterday we talked about the behavior geneticists. What are behavior geneticists? What do they do? What do behavior geneticists do? Yeah.
Behavior geneticists explore the genetic and environmental roles of human beings.
That is correct. So they are going to be looking very closely at chromosomes and genes. They're going to look for the biological factor that influences how we behave. They also, if they are under evolutionary psychology, are going to be looking at behaviors that help us to reproduce and survive. So that's important. So yesterday, when we were talking about all these areas of natural selection, the bottom line is survival of the fittest, right? And when it comes to adaptation and it comes to survival of the fittest, what is most important is the traits that make you more likely to reproduce are going to lead to, those genes will survive. Those traits will be passed on to their offspring, right? Okay. All right, those are fitness. Okay, they become more fit. Make sure I have what I need. All right. Sorry, I really, really do not like not having my own room. Okay. All right, so when we look at what are the similarities among cultures, behavior similarities, one of the things that we notice is that because we all share the same genome, all humans share the same genome, the similarities are almost complete. Less than 5% of the differences among different cultures have to do with population differences. So 95% of the way we behave and the things that come out, like our susceptibility to illnesses, all of those things really come from the fact that we share a human genome. And so we share these same behaviors that lead to our survival with other populations. So we're going to have the same behaviors in the United States that people in East Asia would have. Okay? The only differences between populations only accounts for about 5%. Okay? And that would be because those behaviors have survived and we've adapted, and we're the offspring of those adapted behaviors. Okay. Now, some things that have led to our evolutionary success are no longer helpful to us. For example, your book talks about the fact that in the earliest humans, they would crave sweets. And fats. Why would they do that? Why would they crave sweets and fats? Think about that. What would be the evolutionary advantage to craving sweets and fats?
Well, fats are storage of energy.
Right. So you want to store, they're dense in calories, right? So you would want to store those. However, we still have today in the modern world cravings for fats and sweets. That is no longer advantageous to us. Now it leads to obesity because we have plenty of food, right? Since the agricultural revolution, it leads to diabetes and things like that. Okay? So it's interesting when evolutionary psychologists look at these traits, they definitely say, wait a minute, these traits had a purpose before in our survival as a species, but really don't serve us well anymore. So what do we do about that? Okay? So that's something that's important. All right. They talk about the second Darwinian revolution. So it's like looking at the next wave. Okay, Darwin came up with natural selection, came up with mutations, survival of the fittest, all of these things. How does that apply today? And so when evolutionary psychologists are looking at this, they are trying to extend Darwin's principles. And they take an application of these evolutionary principles and apply them to psychology. So for an example, they would look at studies on infants once they become mobile, once they can move, crawl, walk, etc. Why do they then become fearful of strangers? that's the same time that the onset of fearing strangers comes along. So they would try to look at, okay, what would be the evolutionary advantage to being fearful of strangers? And so they would try to look at that. And some of the ways that they do this and they investigate these questions have to do with, do they have backward theorizing here? I will talk about that. Backward theorizing. And I'll look at that in a minute. Backward theorizing. All right, this stuff is really interesting. One of the things, obviously, if evolutionary psychologists are looking at what most likely enables us to reproduce and survive as a species, they spend a lot of time looking at sexuality and sex drive and gender differences and how the different genders approach sex. And so I'm going to put a term on the board. I'm going to put an expression on the board. And I want your opinion about this. Okay. You read that, right? This boils down what they've discovered. Okay? Females pair wisely and males pair widely. Now, some of the early research they've done, and it's stayed consistent, is that there are a lot of studies that suggest that men have a stronger tendency towards sex. Females are relational, okay, whereas males are recreational. That would be the terminology, okay? But females, if we look at our just as being a base animal creature, okay, females do not have the same strength of a sex drive as males. Some studies that they have done have shown that when they put males and females together and they're hanging out, the coziness or the warm tendencies of the female, it doesn't take much for the male to jump to the conclusion that this woman wants sex. Okay? That's what the studies show. Women are not at the same threshold. Men have a much lower threshold for interpreting female signals that they are willing to have sex. Boom. And the evolutionary psychologists say that is completely evolutionary. That is genetic, that is biological. Because men are trying to propagate. That is their role. Okay? So they approach sex differently. So evolutionary psychologists have done a lot of studies on this, that there is a much lower threshold for a man to perceive that sex is going to happen. Whereas the women's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so there's definitely a discrepancy. And this can cause a lot of interesting relational problems. And by the way, they're doing a lot of studies now in college that these thresholds go even lower when you introduce alcohol. Okay? So that's why there's a lot of issues there. A lot of mixed signals are occurring. Now, dating preferences in partners. So males, very interesting, males are preferring healthy, fertile women. Studies show that males are attracted to women in their peak fertility years, which is their 20s. This is pretty, you will find younger men attracted to women in their 20s. You will find older men attracted to women in their 20s. Evolutionary psychologists would say that is completely understandable and biological because that is peak fertility years. Okay? Early 30s is kind of in there, but really 20s is the peak fertility years. Females, on the other hand, are attracted to affluent males, stable males, okay? Affluent and stable males. They look for dominant and bold men, often, and they want them to be mature. So why would females biologically be attracted to that type of male? What would be the reason?
Because I feel like it's gonna sound bad.
It's going to sound bad. It's fine.
They benefit from like them being stable, and like it helps them out too.
They are looking for someone to raise offspring with, right? If it's totally from an evolutionary psychologist perspective, the males are looking to spread their seed as many and as far and wide as possible, because the goal is to reproduce as much as possible, okay? According to evolutionary psychologists. The female is looking for the man that will be around and will be able to provide so that her offspring will survive. Okay? And no, I'm not promoting sister wives here. I'm not. But they are looking. But that is an evolutionary psychologist viewpoint. If you look at and compare humans to animals, think about that. There's usually an alpha male in a pack, right? The alpha male, and then there's all these females. It's very similar, okay? So it's interesting. So they're looking in some ways for different things. So the idea is that nature selects behaviors that increase the likelihood of sending your genes into the future. Nature selects behaviors that increase the likelihood of sending your genes into the future. And that this in particular will drive males, and that's why they would be attracted to younger women or women in their 20s, older women in their 20s, period, because that is their best chance of sending their genes into the future. If we just bring ourselves down to base animals, okay? All right. Now, evolutionary, there's problems with this. Some people say this is wrong. One of the reasons is you're doing backward theorizing. You're starting with an effect and looking for a reason. Well, what else could we call that? How is that similar to? Overconfidence, hindsight bias for sure, right? So you can just easily explain all of this by going backwards. So that's a critique of this theory. Also, social influences. Your gender differences can affect your mate preferences. Social expectations can shape these things. All right? So, for example, let's think of something in our lives that could affect the way we choose a mate that is not biological. Oh my gosh, I really hope that something has sunk in. You've been here for 3 or 4 years. What could overcome some of these genetic predispositions? That the what? Catholicism, religion, period. Okay? Or just other social expectations. The idea that, no offense males, you are not supposed to be spreading your seed among as many females as possible. In the Catholic perspective, you should have many children, right? Oh, by the way, I will say all sorts of words in here, so we're just going to get over it, okay? Wait till we talk about sexual reproduction. It's very exciting. Okay, so, in more ways than one. All right, so, hopefully, the Catholic Church would say you wouldn't want to do that. Other values would say, you don't have to be married to a rich man. My stepmother's expression is as easy to love a rich man as it is a poor one. Is not really favorable in the eyes of the church, right? You should just love for love. Okay, so there is some impact on social influence. So there are some things that go beyond that. All right. And so the final reflections on nature versus nurture is that gender roles shape us. That's one thing. Gender roles definitely shape us. Genes are all pervasive, but you can reject or reject some of the pull of our genes. For example, there are more and more people who decide not to have children. That is a rejecting of your genes. You're supposed to reproduce, okay? So that is an example. Differences might be initiated by our nature, but are amplified by our nurture. So think about that. Differences might be initiated by our nature, but amplified by our nurture. So you might have a tendency, a biological tendency towards a trait, and maybe that trait is not emphasized in your environment, or it is repressed in your environment. So that could be changed. Also, culture, of course, culture can influence us and cause us to defy what is expected. Culture plays a big role. And then did you see Roger Sperry? Roger Sperry's mind-brain holistic system. Did you see the reference to that? So you should know that. You should know Roger Sperry. And his idea is that the brain creates and controls the emergent mind. The brain, so the biology. The brain creates and controls the emergent mind. So how we think. Which in turn influences the brain. The mind influences the brain. So the brain influences the mind, and then the mind turns around and influences the brain. It is a circle. All right. So, for example, I'm hungry. My brain says, oh, I should go get pizza. That causes me to salivate. Okay? Or I could be thinking, it's lunchtime. I wonder what I want to eat. You could salivate, you could tap in, like you could go backwards, depending on what you're thinking. But they're all one big cycle. All right? All right, that's it. We are done.